Vanakkam, friends. This is ARRM Arun. I'm the president of the Southern India Chamber of Commerce and Industry, SICCI. On behalf of SICCI, we take great pleasure in welcoming our guest for today, Dr. Vandana Gopikumar, for agreeing to join us in today's program. Also, on behalf of SICCI, we would like to extend a warm welcome to each one of you for spending the time with us this evening. As some of you might be aware, SICCI has completed 111 years of service to industry, government, and society. During this time, we have conducted several programs that have been of interest to each one of our stakeholders. We found that during each one of our programs, our stakeholders have addressed us invariably for about 20 to 25 minutes of their time, restricting their addresses to areas of their expertise. We, however, felt that our guests have much more to offer than just the area of expertise. We felt that our guests can very well share with us their all-round path to success, their life's journey, what has led them to where they currently are, and importantly, their inputs for the next generation and society at large. It is with that in mind that we came up with the concept of SICCI 360. We are very glad that SICCI 360 has completed its first year, and we are now in our second year. We completed 12 programs last year, and this is today our second program for this year. While I share a few more words about SICCI 360 in this slide that you see in front of you, I would first like to draw your attention to the names of two of our executives who are mentioned below. Please make a note of them, and if any of you have any trouble connecting during the course of today's discussion, please feel free to give our executives a call, and they'll be glad to assist you reconnect. And in the same context, let me also add that with the rains, I'm sure that a lot of us are facing connectivity bandwidth oriented issues. And in case any of us face that issue, kindly bear with us while we try our best to be able to go through this session. With that in mind, as I said earlier, SICCI 360 is a recent foray for us, and building on the expertise of our seminars, we wanted to give it a multidimensional, we wanted to give the name a multidimensional perspective, because we aim this to be a multidimensional discussion, not just orienting to a particular area of discussion. We also like this to be a lively discussion with each one of our guests, and our guests are certainly experts in their respective fields who will be sharing with us their all-round path to excellence. We have a stringent criteria to select our guests. We certainly look for guests with over 4 decades of experience in their respective industry, and importantly, their contribution to society. Yes, while we have this as a guideline that we go after, we don't restrict ourselves to this criteria. We also look for guests who have certainly played a very large role in contributing to society as our guest for today. This is also an apolitical platform where we are very clear that we do not want to get into any political oriented discussions. The session format that we have for the SICCI 360 series is that we address 5 distinct sessions of our guest speaker. We start off with our guest speaker's expertise. We go into their organization and their role within their organization. We talk about our guest speaker's career path. We talk about our guest inputs for the next generation, and we talk about their inputs for society. We would certainly like you, the audience, to participate along with us. You can always share your comments on the online chat session, and our SICCI 360 team would be glad to have them moderated and fed to us for getting answered during the course of the call. There are 2 guidelines that we follow in this program. Number 1 is that we want our guests to be at comfort at all points of time, so that they find it attractive to come back to us and address us, spend time with us in the future. And secondly, we also want you, the audience, to gain out of your participation here. With those few words, I would now like to share a few words about our guest for today, Dr. Vandana Gopikumar. Dr. Vandana has completed her master's in social work at the Madras School of Social Work. She has done her PhD in mental health, poverty, and homelessness. She's had 26 years of work experience in the social sector. She is the co-founder of the Banyan, as well as the Banyan Academy in Leadership for Mental Health, BALM. She has successfully demonstrated that treatment can be developed along with care and rehabilitation strategies for mentally ill homeless women, not only in urban areas, but also in rural areas. The Banyan was established in 1993 and is today the largest mental health service organization in our country. It has over 2 decades of service that they've been providing, supports homelessness, mental illness, poverty, and serves over 8 lakh people. It functions certainly in the southern part of India, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Assam. And as Dr. Vandana was informing me yesterday, the Banyan's reach is now extending to 8 states within our country, reaching out to more than 10,000 individuals. Dr. Vandana has won the World Health Organization's Public Health Champion Award 2017. She's been awarded the Justice J.S. Verma Award for Women's Empowerment in 2016. WHO and the Swiss Foundation together awarded her for excellence in mental health promotion in 2012, and she also won the Sat Paul Mitchell Award for outstanding service to humanity. With those few words, I would now like to again warmly welcome Dr. Vandana Gopikumar for joining us this evening. Dr. Vandana, vanakkam, எப்படி இருக்கீங்க?
நல்லா இருக்கேன். Thank you. நீங்க எப்படி இருக்கீங்க?
Very well, thank you, and hopefully we are able to see the rains passing us peacefully.
Yeah, I think so too.
So getting started, Dr. Vandana, it was during the early 90s that perhaps the Banyan started, and at that time, not many would have thought that mental health is an issue. Also, the name Banyan, it is an all-encompassing name and gives a lot of comfort and shade with it. What have been your motivations to establish this organization as well as come up with a name like this?
So the name part of it is a very interesting story. When we were, we were 22 and 23 when we started the Banyan, right? Me and my partner Vaishnavi. So it's the two of us who are co-founders of the organization. So it was Vaishnavi's mother who thought of the name the Banyan, because the first idea that we thought of when we wanted to go about setting up an institution for persons with mental health issues that were homeless was shelter. Right? And so she said, yes, there is the shelter component, but we also wanted to establish the fact that each one in society really finds his or her own roots. So the whole idea of the banyan tree offering shelter, but the roots sort of finding their own way, was really the philosophy behind the banyan. And so this was really Vaishnavi's mother's idea, right? Now, why did we start? I think it was a combination of factors, to be honest, because at 22 and 23, it's not as if we set out to start an organization of this nature. We would have normally gotten into regular jobs. I had, of course, done my psychiatric social work, and therefore I was inclined to work in the sector, but not so much start off by myself right at the beginning. But I think there was a combination of factors, and the most critical factor was our contact with a woman who was outside our college, Women's Christian College. So we did our English literature there, and then I went on to do my master's in the Madras School of Social Work. So as I saw her, I saw a sea of humanity around her, but I saw that it was a really crowded road, and she was very scantily clad, right? So in her, as I sort of tried to establish contact and interact with her, I realized that there was such a sense of fear and alienation, almost as if she was in a bubble and people were passing her by. So that hit me hard, because that woman was somewhat my age and Vaishnavi's age, and it could certainly have been us. And the fact that there was a whole wide world around her, and many of them predominantly women, and not either having the adequate amount of information or feeling somewhat intimidated by, the idea of interacting with a person who was very visibly sort of schizophrenic. So she was speaking to herself, she was gesticulating widely and sort of running down the road, and perhaps would have even met with an accident. So I think that interaction, the sense of alienation, the sense of loneliness, the fact that the world can just pass you by and you can be left behind, the sense of fear that I will never forget in her eyes, is probably the reason that we thought that something needed to be done for this group. But what we did at that point is, with help from our principal, we admitted her into an institution that did the best that they could for her. But unfortunately, it wasn't sort of focused care, it wasn't comprehensive, and it wasn't tailor-made to respond to the needs of homeless women with mental health issues. Those challenges are multifold, right? And therefore, here were two young women taking her in an auto to this place, feeling quite happy that we'd achieved a lot. But then after a few days when she left, we realized the problem was complex. It wasn't the organization to blame, but it was the system to blame. And so we said, why don't we sit down and do something ourselves and plunge deep into it and start off by offering services for this group, and not just offering services of, like I mentioned earlier, housing or medical treatment, but also looking at a life that me or Vaishnavi would like to live. That is the ability to really chase your dreams and live life on your own terms. So with that as the beginning, I think the seed of the Banyan was sown. And both Vaishnavi and I decided to live with the people that we serve, because we wanted to understand the problem inside out and gain first-hand experience. And therefore, for the first 7 or 8 years, we spent time living with the people that we served until we realized that it was time for us to sort of transition into another stage of our life. So that was really the beginning of the Banyan.
It's certainly very common for people at large to pass by somebody in need like that, like what you experienced. But it's certainly uncommon as to how many people really do what you and your partner were able to do in terms of setting up an organization that not only is assisting a handful of people, but society at large. So certainly something of great appreciation. And I think these are the ways that we should bring in the lack of apathy in society and try to be able to get people to realize that each one has a society orientation. But Dr. Vandana, moving on, during your teens, you yourself had existential questions and conflicts because of chaos that has existed in society, perhaps even today, that this chaos exists in society. How should one handle this situation if they find themselves in such a situation as well?
So I think life is difficult, but some of the most difficult years in life are really between, I would say, 11 to about 18, 19, 20, right? That's when you're growing up. There are transitions in your life. You're meeting new sorts of people. Your brain is developing. Your thought patterns and structures are being formed. So, I mean, there are 3 or 4 incidents that really affected me during those formative years. One was the fact that I was used to seeing help at home, right? And at that point, very often you had young girls coming and working for you. And my father was in the Air Force, so we traveled from place to place. And when I saw these children, when I saw that each of us had a different trajectory in life simply by virtue of where we were born, it affected me a little bit. And I constantly would speak with my parents about this. The second thing is when we would go out and to get our ice cream or shopping, just like we do now at traffic signals, you see a whole lot of people, without access to basic amenities. Forget about, ice creams, but just even food or milk for children. So that hit me really hard, that while I was here having my ice cream or looking at buying the next dress or thinking of my future, sitting inside the car comfortably with my parents, there were several others who didn't have access to this privilege, as a result of which, again, they lived a different life. So these two worlds created a lot of questions within me. And then, as much as they created questions within me, I think human nature and cruelty also sort of hit me somewhat hard. When, one incident in particular, and I don't know if I should talk about it, but so I'm very fond of animals. And my mother, was one day when I came back, she was extremely upset because she just heard that young puppies that people didn't want had been buried alive because they wanted to get rid of them. So I think a combination of seeing human nature, both the good and bad sides, but here we're talking about inequities, we're talking about different life trajectories based on where you're born, we're talking about cruelty. That sort of got me somewhat interested in human beings, in complex problems, in the way in which society is structured, and in the way in which different people approach life, either ducking these problems or facing these problems, being cognizant of them and attempting to do their little bit, if you may. So that resulted, I think, in a little bit of, my being sensitive to people and issues of the world. It did, of course, result in, because as you know, rumination sometimes excessively results in a little bit of, not very positive moments in life. But I think you have to go through those not very great moments to perhaps get past your own self and fight your own inner conflicts and demons and rise above what you think, who you think you are. And these incidents and a series of them helped me do just that.
So in that context, what would be your input for say another person who finds themselves in such a situation?
Of what? Situation of existential crisis?
Correct.
So I wouldn't want to generalize solutions, but I would think that it's important not to ignore the questions that come your way. It would be important to introspect. As you introspect, it would be important for you to share these conversations with a few trusted friends or with your support circle and ideate, because it's always useful to look at the way in which different people perceive the same situation. And in doing so, you're also building, I think, a conversation around a thought or idea that is of concern to you. And therefore, I think one, don't ignore, two, be reflective and introspect, but three, do it with a support circle. So it doesn't sort of suck you in, but helps you focus on a problem-solving mode.
Perhaps can also say that solution is always there. No matter what the problem is, there's always a solution, and there's never an end to it.
I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that there are solutions. And I'd like to think that all of us are, at heart, our core is really, or our essence is really goodness and kindness. But somewhere, like I said, we have to get past ourselves and past many layers that we've built around ourselves to preserve ourselves, to find that core, to be able to respond to the problems that we look at, and therefore to problem solve as a society, as a collectivist society, and as a movement. Because if we get stuck in something that distances ourselves from the other, then there is a chance for us not to engage, which is why we're perhaps several years post-independence, not in as great a situation as we'd like to be. And
Right.
that definitely has mental health implications.
Right. Now, when we talk about psychology and people, certainly a lot of people have psychological issues for sure. And these psychological issues stem from various different aspects of life. It might be work stress, it might be any family-oriented stress or anything of that sort. And certainly the amount of psychological issues that people have are very relative. Some people might have less and some people might have more. Do you think medical treatment is essential for a person with psychological issues, or counseling will suffice? And in that context, there's a line of thought that says that psychology itself is a Western thought, and in India it was not really there. It was more of philosophy. What is your take on this?
So to answer your first question, I think medical treatment, so there are different kinds. There are 150 million Indians who live with one or the other mental health condition, right? And 1 to 3% of them live with what's referred to as severe mental disorders. So that would be schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, essentially psychosis and that spectrum. Now, in that case, I would think medical treatments are definitely necessary, right? Now, in the case of distress or sadness or grief that is natural, let's say if you've lost your house, or if you're not able to achieve your dreams, or if you lost a loved one, right? If it is within a sort of realm of what is seen to be normal, so X number of, so for example, for depression, you say, let's look at it for 2 weeks. And if your pattern of sadness continues over a period of 2 weeks, where everything that was of interest to you now is no longer of interest, right? And if it isn't related to a situational context or an event, then you would perhaps seek a psychiatrist and look at the first line of treatment to be perhaps counseling, or even, like you mentioned, philosophical sort of approaches. And for me, so what is philosophy? Let's just deconstruct this a little bit. So philosophy essentially is a theory, and a theory that guides you in your behavior. So in a sense, you're coming back to what psychology also is, right? Or what mental health is. If you look at psychiatry, then you can view it using a biomedical lens. But if you move beyond psychiatry and look at mental health, then you look at the social sciences, you look at anthropology, you look at social work, you look at sociology, you look at psychology, and you look at the behavioral sciences. And why do people feel a certain feelings? Why do they emote in particular ways? Why do they experience certain emotions? And how do emotions and feelings influence, therefore, their behaviors? So as much as this is psychology, equally this is also philosophy, because there are certain guiding theories that are common to the two. So I would think mental health is pretty much about life, because as much as, so this is referred to as psychiatric pluralism, right? So your model could be biomedical, your model could be spiritual, where if you look at the history also of, sort of mental health, in the earliest times, people attributed it to demonic possessions. They attributed it to curse by God. And then you move to the period of science, where they said, hey, no, it could be, something a little more scientific. And then you went through the Middle Ages, and then you moved on to the modern times. So the history itself is very interesting, of how you began with curse and the gods and, demonic forces, and you moved from there to science, right? Still, I mean, as much as you've done that, equally, while neuroimaging and the like have sort of gained a lot of importance, I think, over the past few years, you still don't have a test that sort of detects a problem, like, let's say, dengue or malaria or COVID or whatever. So you have questionnaires and you have understanding of the person. And therefore, it's important to have these diverse conceptualizations. And in that context, psychiatric pluralism becomes very important. So it's never just the biomedical event. The precipitating factors or the predisposing factors could be biomedical in the case of severe mental disorders, or even in the case of common mental disorders like depression and anxiety. It could be biomedical. But the precipitating factors are often stressors, often the social context, often to do with a lot with relationships, often to do with the world and the injustices that we face and the way in which we prepare ourselves to respond to that. So psychology and counseling, yes, therefore has a role, but equally the social has a role, which is why the models range from biomedical to social constructivist to social reflexive to psychological to spiritual. And you draw a lot of hope from just imbibing a sense of spirituality. And that's when maybe the Indian philosophy part comes in handy, because for us, for Indians, sometimes spirituality is sort of a symbol of hope, a symbol of goodness, a symbol of victory of, let's say, good over evil. So you're hoping for a better tomorrow. So whether religion is a social construct or whether it is, for real, either which way, the philosophy of religion is similar to the philosophy of psychology, because both provide you with a sense of hope.
We now move on to the second section for today on organization and role. Before I ask you my first point there, would also like to draw your attention to some of the pictures that we are sharing with our audience. And if you feel that you'd like to share anything about that particular picture, please feel free to go ahead. Having said that, I would now like to ask you this question about your organization. You've not had any experience before you started an organization. but you've still been able to make a good difference to society. Has this been because of your very good exposure within your college curriculum, or has it just been getting to know it as you go along? What is your what have been your learnings that can be of assistance to future entrepreneurs? And in that context also, is it very important that one has financial support before they want to be able to serve society in any form?
Yeah, so I think my education did help me to a certain extent in terms of general information that I had on clinical social work, on mental health, on the Indian society, and on complex problems, right? But social entrepreneurship wasn't really an active part of this. So I think most of our learning was really achieved by plunging in and by sort of locating ourselves very close to the problem and learning things firsthand by doing. So our pedagogy for ourselves was really very constructivist, that you do and you learn, and there are feedback loops, and therefore you apply again and you learn, reinvent, reinvent. And of course, you have your ups and downs, you have your challenges, you have your problems, you make mistakes, and you learn as you move along. And you also grow as individuals as you move along, and therefore your journey grows. So ours has been, therefore, a very organic journey, which has been led not so much by our vision as social entrepreneurs, but I think we've essentially played the role of a catalyst and been driven by goals that the people that we serve have set for ourselves. So the service users of the Banyan, people who are homeless and with mental health issues, who demonstrated great grit and courage. These are women who've sort of really decided what is required. And what is really required is care across one's lifespan. So as I mentioned, there are predisposing factors, sure, but what about the precipitating factors? If you don't address the precipitating factors around stress, around injustices, around disharmony, around relationships, you're not going to be tackling the problem in its entirety. You're probably only talking about quick fixes and band-aids, where you're resorting maybe to a pill-popping culture and coupling it with counseling and coming back maybe a little happier, but going back again to the same social context where there are caste, class, and gender-based discrimination and related violences. So if society doesn't change, and if we remain the way that we are, where 37% or more lives below the poverty line, really it's 70% living on $2 or lesser, many in unstable situations of housing, we are way down now in the hunger index, right? Gender parity, gender inequity index, we're way down. Now, all these are the social determinants of mental ill health that need to be addressed for, I would say, a very wholesome sort of response to the way in which a person recovers or heals or gains a sense of agency. So he or she is able to re-enter not just society, but engage with experiences and re-enter life in a sense, because sometimes this can be so crushing to the spirit. So I think our entrepreneurial skills and that spirit was probably there because we liked challenges and we liked complex problems, but we didn't start off with a blueprint. We went on to learn to develop a blueprint. We went on to learn to develop strategies. We did a lot of reading. We were engaged academically as well with multiple stakeholders. We did see the global context of mental health, but our main teachers were the people that we served. And finances, your second question. Yes. So finances do help, because we couldn't have managed to do what we did without finances. But then I would, sort of turn around and ask the question about our start. When we started, we had only the little that our parents gave us and the small group of trustees gave us, because we thought there would be 30 women in the in the city of Chennai, and we do our little bit in this little house and, just decide that, hey, the problem is solved and people have gone back either home or they're in jobs and they're doing well, and now we're moving on. But then as we plunge deeper, we realized that the problem was huge. So 1.7 million individuals live homeless. 150 million Indians today live with a mental health issue. And that intersectionality is so complex that it converts itself into such a wicked problem that you need not just one blueprint, but multiple. And for multiple stakeholders to come together, whether it's the government, whether it's many, many civil society organizations, and of course, the corporate sector, this becomes extremely critical in today's context. So I think along the way, finances came, and I believe that what is required to make a change really is intent, clear idea, a clear vision that your goal and what you intend to do is beyond everything else. So nothing else really matters more than the vision that you pursue, right? Not yourself, not the organization. It is really the vision and the cause. So as much as it's the Banyan, it is the vision of social change for the persons that we serve that today is more important to me than the Banyan itself. Money or whatever else that needs to come to support this vision, you do strategize as a social entrepreneur to be able to raise that. But the strength for you to do that comes from the fact that you are determined and persuasive and focused on your vision. And therefore, there is a need from within, like we discussed earlier, which arises from your multiple intelligences, from your social context, your experiences, but also from your sense of EQ and your sense of empathy, saying that the world has to be more equal, right? And therefore, I think, yes, finances help, but would we have done it if we didn't have finances? Would we have gotten this far? I don't know. But would we have done it at all? Of course we would have done it. Would we have left that woman there? Of course not. Would I continue to, focus on the same vision if I didn't have anything, or if I didn't have access to privilege and didn't have the support network that I have today? Of course I would. I would probably struggle harder, but I wouldn't for any reason let go of the vision that perhaps in many ways has saved my life and given me a sense of identity and made me who I am, right? So
Banyan today has created a movement in the field of mental health. We can say that within India for sure, and perhaps globally also. And well, recognizing that you are today a member of the first mental health policy group that's been constituted by the government of India. What policies have been brought out by this policy group, and what is the status of its implementation in your opinion?
Okay, so Banyan is one of the leaders in the mental health sector, of course, nationally and globally, but there are several other stakeholders, and I must just put that on record, who are doing extremely brilliant work. So we're perhaps not the leading organization, but one of the leading actors. And I say that in all humility, and at the same time, I'm very grateful for the encouragement that you give us by placing us the way that you do. Also, we're not 26 years old, just a small correction. We're 30. So this is our 30th year. And we work in 3 states, and you mentioned 2 of those correctly. That's Tamil Nadu and Kerala. The third is Maharashtra. But in the other 9 states that we discussed yesterday, yes, including Karnataka, Assam, our models are sort of being taken to scale. So a mental health policy group, coming back to that question, was set up in 2012 by a very good friend of mine who was then the health secretary, who unfortunately passed 2 months ago, Mr. Keshav Desiraju. It was, so he brought together a diverse group of academics, practitioners, civil society actors, persons from the government, caregivers, persons with mental health challenges themselves, and decided that the policy needed to address essentially 3 issues. One is that it ought to make care accessible, affordable, and appropriate. And I underline appropriate, because like you mentioned, it could be biomedical when required in terms of a response, sometimes only psychological without medicines, and sometimes a combination of the 2, and sometimes maybe just philosophical and discussion with your support networks, and maybe faith, right? So he wanted as much as possible of, just, what shall I say, widespread thinking, with the goal of reaching the most disadvantaged and making care as appropriate as possible. That was 1. 2 is that he realized, and the group realized, that the only way in which you could do that is if you focused on intersectionalities and on the social determinants. And therefore, you make mental health care a basic right for all, and you make it accessible in rural areas and in villages and in district hospitals and in primary health centers, but you don't just address it using the sort of medicines that you have to, but you address it also by addressing the social determinants, like I mentioned earlier, and therefore focus on other aspects of care that would be required in terms of convergence with other departments, like let's say the Department of Disability, that would award you a disability allowance to deal with poverty related issues, or the Department of Food and Nutrition, which would sort of award you, enable you access PDS and therefore make sure that you don't go hungry, or with the Department of Education and make sure that education introduces life skills early on in schools, so children are able to deal with these issues. So convergence between sectors to make sure that the social determinants were dealt with, so the person would not just deal with the symptoms and not just focus on symptom reduction as the point of recovery, but focus on well-being as the point of recovery, and therefore money, food, participation in society, access to employment and reservation linked to employment, all of this would become very critical to a mental health policy. The third focus, and the most important therefore, was the role of peer advocates. So the role of people with mental health issues or challenges themselves and their caregivers in taking forward or advance the movement in advancing the vision of equitable care for all that is sort of wholesome, robust, addresses intersectionalities, addresses social determinants, and not just focuses on recovery and symptom reduction, but focuses overall on well-being, giving place or prominence to the recovery movement led by peer advocates. Therefore, reforms around mental hospitals, moving away from a culture of coercion, focused on a culture of participation, focused on co-production of knowledge, focused on diverse models for diverse needs. So to that extent, I think we've made, from 2012 to now, a great deal of progress in two areas. At that point, there were about 150 or 160 districts covered by the mental health program, the district mental health program, which typically is supposed to percolate down to the primary health center and offer medication, but still is very much sort of tertiary center bound and operates as satellite clinics. But we have made progress, and it covers almost 3/4 of the districts now, if not all the districts. In Tamil Nadu, it covers all the districts, the district mental health program. The second thing that has happened is the peer movement. So the peer movement has been very strong and has driven several reforms in the 47 mental hospitals that we have. These are sort of very archaic structures that are influenced with the colonial system of the asylum, where people were sort of not treated well, tucked away. The whole culture of poorhouses came, people were chained. The treatment that the persons with mental health issues have been meted out has been, cruel to say the least. So moving away from that culture, preventing overcrowding, reforming these centers, having more person-centered care, we've come, I think, a significant distance, but not a long way. Where I feel the two areas that things are still lacking is convergence. The health and the social sector haven't really converged to address the social determinants. And therefore, as much as symptom reduction and access to medication may be possible, equally, the focus on employment, the focus on a disability allowance to deal with poverty, the focus on, let's say, a much more vulnerable groups such as homeless people with mental health issues and their needs, or women and single parents and their needs, or child caregivers, that has not been focused on. Poverty reduction schemes for this group has not been focused on. PDS is going on. Voting rights are sort of taken off a little bit. But this intersectionality hasn't been dealt with as much as one would sort of like for it to be.
You alluded to cruelty in terms of treatment of some of these people. Is it because of lack of sufficient policies, or is it because of lack of implementation that we continue to face this? And in that context, if I can also add another question as to what has been the recovery rate of people with mental health issues?
So in terms of cruelty, I think it's to do with human nature. The first asylum that was set up late 1300s was not set up with the intention of cruelty. It was set up to serve as many people as it could. But unfortunately, what happened is that several people with mental health issues just emerged, who until then didn't have a place to go to. And therefore, the place became overcrowded. When it became overcrowded, there was limited human resources, limited financial investments, and therefore they became sort of hotbeds for violations, because people didn't have access to appropriate food, they didn't have access to appropriate care, there was a lot of abuse, the relationship between the care provider and the care receiver was hierarchical, to say the least, and in a sense they were segregated from society because they were seen as different, and therefore this whole culture of othering began at that point, right? And that's what's happening even today, that the problem is so large and there is a need for many beds, but the solution is not for one monolith and a large asylum, but for smaller places and for integration in primary health centers, which actually again has happened in Tamil Nadu in the context of the Emergency Care and Recovery Center, right? So you want smaller centers, you want person-centered care, you want the right client caregiver ratio, and you want greater budgets and investments. Now, if all of this is not happening, you will see what you see. But having said that, mental health is also a very complex problem. And therefore, while asylums and the state is responsible and is completely culpable if there are issues such as, you know, chaining, or if there is this hierarchy, or if there is abuse, one also has to be cognizant of the reasons why families may not know how to respond. Sometimes there is lack of awareness, and sometimes we've heard so many people say that, you know, we have to go work to make sure that we're able to earn a little bit of money and bring that money back to feed our other children. So in the process, if I have to take care of this, my other loved one, so she doesn't run away and, you know, just sort of die on the railway track, I have to keep her tied at home. So there are really two different realities. One is where the state ought to take cognizance of the fact that it is a care provider and it needs to provide care the way in which public institutions, need to have a mandate and guidelines and protocols for them to be run effectively and efficiently. And that is a non-negotiable. But at the home level and at the caregiver provider level, I think there is a need for a little more empathy, a little more support for the care provider. And so the care provider is at home able to offer the sort of care that the person requires. So I would think that and this is in the case of many care providers, but there is a segment, of course, that abandons people. Otherwise, you wouldn't have as many homeless people as you do, right? That is one of the reasons. So there, it is human nature in a sense of cruelty. So I would think in the lack of intent on the part of state, or part of civil society, a firm sort of decision-making capability, a firm belief that change is needed, is a sign of neglect. Similarly, I would think that on the part of persons who abandon people with mental health issues, it's human nature and it's survival of the fittest. I'm not able to take care of myself. How do I take care of another person who's in distress? And this person is of no use to me, so let me just abandon the person. And on another level of cruelty, this person's different from me, so let me segregate the person, let me bully the person, let me pelt stones, let me abuse the person. So there's multiple layers of our distance from a person with a mental health challenge, and based on who we are, our behavior with that person varies. But hierarchies exist, social constructs exist, and this dominance is something that we simply have to do away with.
Moving on, how successful has Banyan been in assisting rehabilitated women start self-help groups? Do we have success stories in this context? And perhaps if I can also add another question, where many times we have rehabilitated women who are not taken back by their respective family, perhaps because of the associated social stigma. How do you think we should handle this sad scenario?
Okay, so I'll answer your second question first. Now, I'm going to narrate a story. There was this woman, Kumari, and this is such a famous story because I've narrated it so many times, but she was found by the police and brought to the Banyan and diagnosed with bipolar affective disorder. And I'm just sort of, summarizing the story, but essentially she was, after a while, with adequate treatment, counseling, support, vocational training, in our vocational training center, she would stitch these little clothes, and she said that she was missing her husband and her little children, and she needed to go back to Pratapgarh in Uttar Pradesh. So we, when we had enough money, we made a trip, and there were several people whom we sort of took back home. And very often the people who come to us are not people who have exact addresses. So we're not in a position to write to them and check whether, they exist, unless, and at that point, when we started off, there was no mobile phone, nothing else, and many of these people didn't have telephones either. So connectivity was poor. So when we got down at Pratapgarh, the first thing that she said was, she looked at the clock tower and said that, no, this doesn't look like Pratapgarh. So we went to the police station and said, hey, is there a missing persons report? And they said no. So we were almost on the verge of giving up. But then just as we were crossing the railway track and planning to get into the car, we saw this person look at us as if he had seen a ghost pushing a cycle. And then he said, aren't you Bela's mother? And we said yes, because we knew the daughter's name. And then he said, come, let me take you to your house. And we went to the house that was decorated. The first thing that we saw was her picture hanging outside with a garland. And by then, the whole village, because, in villages, typically, most people, it's a collectivist society. So they gathered around and they started explaining to us that it had been 6 years since she'd wandered away and that her husband had passed. And the second thing that we saw was that she was standing there looking at her picture in a state of shock with those little clothes that she tailored for her kids. But grown-up kids came back and just sort of hugged her and broke down in tears, and that was such a happy reunion. The reason that the house was all full of fairy lights was because we got back on the same day that her daughter was getting married. So as much as we'd like to believe that families abandon their loved ones only because they don't care, equally you have a parallel story of, for every person who abandons, you have several people who don't abandon, who persistently care, and who face all odds to try and take. For example, in Ramkumari's case, they took her to a faith healing center. They took her to a hospital that was several kilometers away, so they had to forsake their wages. They had to go stay there for a long while. She came back, she stopped medicines. They took her again to another faith healing center. Much of it failed, and one day she wandered away, got into the train, and ended up over here. So what I'm trying to say is, unless the district mental health program gets into not just the cities, but the rural areas, and not just at the district level, so if it is, let's say, a Trichy, not just Trichy district, but percolates downwards, like so goes to the various other smaller rural areas through the primary health center, you're going to face this problem because it is difficult to reach a service, especially in the case of mental health, right? So at that point, we had a survey done, and this was along with NIMHANS, and we realized that one of the major reasons that people end up homeless is not because families are abandoning. That is a minuscule percentage of the total number of people who end up homeless. Who actually end up homeless probably because there's lack of unstable housing and lack of primary caregivers, and certainly lack of access to mental health care. Right? So the abandonment theory is not entirely true. There are a few people, like I said, who would, but for the larger majority, it is really people who aren't able to access care and who don't have the means to care for the loved one. And therefore, those have to be provided. To answer your first question, yes, we are extremely happy that there are many self-help groups, many people who are working independently. So we've serviced 1 million low-income households. Through our emergency care and recovery center, we've serviced about 3,000 homeless persons with mental health issues. And through our long-term services, we've serviced about 500 people. But 2 of these models are being taken to scale. So hoping that the impact annually in each of these programs will be 1,000 more. And therefore, it will, over a period of time, cumulatively add up and impact not just urban homelessness, but rural homelessness. So homelessness as a result of lack of access to care will perhaps be addressed as a result of the scale up. But having said that, 33% of our workforce constitutes persons with mental health challenges. So what have they done? And one, again, I'll narrate, there are several things. So many of our care providers are people with mental health issues. Some of them have formed a social cooperative and they run the canteen. Some of them have formed a social cooperative and they run a small salon. Some of them have formed a social cooperative and they actually run one of our Home Again programs in Govindakuruchi in Trichy district. These are two sisters. One of them who was actually locked up, they lost their parents. Post losing their parents, one of them lost her child and her husband abandoned her. So she faced the death of her mother, the death of her father, the death of her child. And then she that's predisposing factors plus stress resulted in her, having a manic sort of episode, post which the villagers got her and put her into a little hut where she was locked, and her food was thrown in from under. Her sister, Amali, I mean, I'm mentioning them by names because they speak about their own lived experience and they are sort of change makers now. And Amali has been interviewed by Rajdeep Sardesai on national television as well. And she speaks about her experience where she was trying to care for her sister on the one hand, but on the other hand, trying to take care of her own little child when her husband died by suicide. And as her husband died by suicide, after a little while, she got married again to the husband's brother so that there would be some financial support in the absence of everything else. He died in an accident. So she then developed depression, not really bipolar disorder or anything else, but just depression. But who wouldn't when there's so much of stress in the background? These two women post-care said, we want to go back to the same village and show that recovery is possible. Show that people with mental health challenges can care using their collective wisdom and feed into programs in a way in which nobody else can, because we have the lived experience. So we have a first-hand understanding of what it is to live with a mental health challenge and what recovery means. So today they run one of our programs and have been featured by the WHO as one of the finest peer leaders, and their program is also featured in a guidance manual by the WHO. So yes, there are support groups, and yes, many of them in the Banyan are people with mental health issues. But am I happy overall with the state of employment of people with mental health issues? Certainly not. Globally, it is at a low. It's far lower than those without mental health issues. And again, there is a gender disparity. So many more men gain work rather than women, and in the Indian context, much more so because of the social norms and mores and social roles that women are assigned. But within the Banyan ecosystem, yes, we've seen change, which goes to show that if only we were to try and if only equal opportunity was provided, then people would shine. And in the case of women in particular, we've seen that in the health during the COVID period in particular, I'm digressing just for a minute, the most number of persons, I think 75% of the workforce globally that contributed towards COVID-related care was female. And that was at the community mobilizer level. And yet leadership at the same level is less than 10%. So I feel that we somehow hesitate to recognize the competencies of women, both at social change levels and at leadership levels.
My next point stems from the fact that SICCI is a chamber and represents industry. And in that context, certainly when we look at mental health, not everybody with a mental health problem is born with it. There are a good number of people who acquire it in the course of time for various different reasons. Now, when we have employees in industry across walks of life, it's very important that these employees have a healthy mind and a healthy body so that they can work effectively and contribute effectively as well. What would you say, or rather before that, these people certainly have their own stress that they need to cope with, whether it's work-related, family-related, and so on. What would you say are your suggestions in order for corporates to be able to ensure that they are able to work with people and ensure a stable mind balance so that people don't have to go through this path at any point of time?
Okay, so this is something that I think is our quest. I think it's the quest of all human beings to really achieve that balance and that sense of what we refer to as stability. So in terms of and stability varies person to person. The 2 or 3 things that I'll share that help me, for example, is one. I think, again, it's important for us to have a vision and priorities in life that we set for ourselves, right? And to stick by it. And so the reason you stick by it is because you bring in your own set of values and principles. So if you have that framework of your values, principles, and your vision, you typically know who you are and what you want to be and where you're headed. And therefore, whatever that you do, so I really don't believe in work-life balance, because I believe that I'm in the flow. And at the best point of life, based on what Maslow said as well, right? When you self-actualize, you're typically in the flow. So you're your essence and you're enjoying yourself and you're ecstatic because you're doing what you want to, not ecstatic all the time, but essentially you're in the flow. So I would think that these distinct identities of I work now and this is my personal time is not something that I'm very comfortable with. But instead, if everything could just, if you could be in the flow in whatever moment that you are and be present to that moment, that is a huge plus. So be in the flow, set yourself a vision and values, and then be in the flow. So you're able to feel one with the task that you're doing. So it doesn't turn into a chore and you're present to that moment and you feel a sense of well-being then. The second thing that I do is write a gratitude journal. I think it's very easy for us to focus on things that are not favorable or that aren't going well. But equally, there are many things that are going well. And human nature is such that we tend to focus, and science also says this, there is evidence that sort of substantiates this, that we focus more on the negative than on the positive, whether it is pain, whether it's negative emotions, you tend to focus more on the negative. So for you to be aware of all the things and the ways in which the world has come together to, sort of offer you the opportunity to even just be alive, right, is something that you should perhaps learn to appreciate. And that sense of appreciation sort of kicks in at a brain level, right? And therefore your circuits sort of open up. And I think that gratitude journal and just reading that is something that absolutely helps me to know that, hey, I have so many people by my side. Hey, I've not done too badly for myself. Hey, I have my lovely pet who helps me, right? The third that I would think is to be real and honest and authentic. Authenticity is the one trait that takes you far in life, because there is no what one refers to as cognitive dissonance, right? There is no conflict between who you are, what you say, and who you're trying to be. It's the same. So be real, be authentic to the extent possible. Of course, compromises are sometimes needed, but I think it's important to be authentic. But authentic with a sense of humility, authentic with a sense of kindness. Therefore, when you're expressing yourself, simply because you want to be authentic and you feel that you are in the right in a particular situation, the way you express yourself when with a sense of kindness is very different from when you express yourself from a position of anger or from a position of dominance or from a position of frustration. Therefore, I would think be authentic, but with humility and with a sense of kindness, and share your opinions freely and engage in more sort of dynamic discourses and discussions, knowing that I come to the fourth, that largely we can be and are an interdependent society. And therefore feelings of shame, feelings of fear, feelings of conflict emerge because we're constantly thinking of ourselves as nuclear families, as in silos, and not as one society. If we would challenge this thought or idea and think of us as an interdependent society, then we would somewhat blur our boundaries around shame, around conflict, and be sort of more caring and more open and more empathic. And lastly, my huge mood upper, I have 3 or 4. Of course, cultivate hobbies, the usual things, whatever the hobby, yoga, dance. I love dance. I'm always with pets. Surround yourself with things that you like doing. I like visiting temples. I like, taking the car and heading out, which is a combination of usually work and sort of visiting temples, visiting friends, churches, mosques, all of that. So I just feel that set aside some time where you're able to combine some fun factor But also, in addition to your hobbies, I think keep some me time where you are sort of immersed in yourself. You have time to sort of calm down and get to your baseline where you're you and you're sort of self-reflective. So I think the combination of the journal and being in the flow and being authentic and then showing humility and working on around interdependence, throwing in a few hobbies, and working on this me time, sort of, which is very essential to me, can be helpful.
We now move on to the third section on career path. Keeping an eye on the time, I'm going to be combining a few of the questions and also perhaps skipping a few. So the first point here is your parents have been of great support to you, as well as your co-founder, Ms. Vaishnavi. But we'd like to hear about that. And also we'd like to hear about your research leading to PhD, how it has helped realize your goals.
Okay, so the first question I'll answer very briefly, that yes, like I mentioned earlier, both Vaishnavis and my parents have imbibed in us values that allows for us to believe that the world is a good place, that allows us to believe that there is a need for us to challenge injustices, that allows us to believe that we need to engage with complex problems that affect fellow citizens. And they didn't do it by being didactic or preachy. They simply did it by being who they were. And we simply imbibed those values from them. Besides that, at every point, whether it was Vaishnavi's father, he passed on recently, coming and helping us through every program, through every construction that we had. He was a part of many of our committees, or my mother cooking when we started off for the first 13 clients and sending food and taking calls on our behalf, or both our parents offering us some monies that they had because they came from some positions of privilege, not great privilege, but some positions of privilege, which was sufficient for us to kickstart. Or even, sort of endorsing the idea that a thought like this at 22 and 23 was not to be entirely crushed. I think all of this greatly helped us. And therefore, there was a free flow of conversation and ideas. As far as my PhD goes, I think the reason that BALM, the Banyan Academy of Leadership, sort of was founded was alongside my academic career and my interest in research, but not particularly research of the sort that is done in the form of randomized controlled trials. I'm more a qualitative researcher, and I use more qualitative methods, where it's the question that is the heroine of the story. And you just simply try to answer the question, whether it's using lived experiences, whether it's using case studies, whether it's using ethnography, whether it's using photo voice. So I learned a lot about how this false dichotomy between practice and research existed only in a very myopic vision of what research was. Therefore, my research was really transdisciplinary and focused on multiple stakeholders, multiple overlaps, and answering that key question using these complexities of the real world. So much of what we were doing earlier was also science, because we were understanding a problem, and feedback from the problem was the solutions that emerged was fed back into the problem, and there were those feedback loops. So at every point, there was a little bit of science and a little bit of research. Similarly, over here, there was certainly, the idea of research sort of broadened, which gave me the opportunity, awarded me then a professorship at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and brought me in contact with several other collaborators, both local and international, including collaborators from the VU Amsterdam, from Cornell, from NYU, and the like. Yeah, so I think it's more advancing our research vision.
We now move on to the next section, which is next generation. We have a student with us, Mr. Hari. He's doing his third year engineering at SVC. Hari, are you online? If so, please go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, Hari, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, ma'am, regarding before I proceed on asking with my question, I can relate with the thing you told me earlier during the whole speech, the one where you would see children near traffic signals, or near the roadsides, and you would feel a little bit guilty, or you would think about them later on. My point being is, with so much exposure facilitated by technology, do you think younger generations' perception towards mental health has changed?
So I think the younger generation is far more aware of mental health challenges because the sort of information asymmetry that our generation faced because of lack of access to knowledge is not something that this generation faces. So the good side of technology is really the access to information, being connected. But as much as I say that, equally there is a flip side. I think you should sort of control technology and use it in ways in which you gain from it, instead of technology controlling you and you're turning into sort of a victim where you're constantly scrolling or hooked on to looking at other people's Insta pages or Facebook pages, and constantly comparing yourself with the other. So there is a lot of evidence and a lot of research that's happened that points in the direction of the use of social media, and not so much technology that benefits, technology that guides, technology that can solve complex problems, but social media per se that results in attention deficits, that sometimes results in a sense of being sort of relatively inadequate in comparison to somebody else, feelings of depression, feelings of despair, and also a breakdown in relationships because you're constantly, instead of looking at the other person, looking at the phone. And naturally relationships therefore don't sort of and conversations don't reach the sort of the level that they can, right? So I think there's a flip side to technology. Of course, the generation is much more aware, but what do you do with the awareness? Because it's important. This is an important topic in particular because today in India and globally, and India contributes hugely to the number of deaths by suicide, right? The age group most affected is 15 to 29. And those dying are age groups 15 to 29. So this is really a crisis. And why is it? I mean, poverty is one of the reasons, but it's not the topmost. It's relationship issues, right? And so I think as much as technology can help, equally we need to be in control of it for it to truly help. And we take the positives and we keep away from what could even be sort of an addictive pattern that is simply not healthy.
Our next question is from, again, another member of the audience. It's Dr. V. Balaji, who's the chair of our healthcare committee. Dr. Balaji, if you are online, please go ahead.
Sir?
Yes, Bhavani.
Doctor's connection, there is some connectivity issue, sir. He got disconnected.
Okay, doesn't matter. Dr. Vandana, what kind of support do you give to children of parents with mental health issues?
Okay, so I would so let me begin by saying that the support that they give us now is so amazing because we offer support to about 1,000 odd children from disadvantaged communities, and close to 60% of them are children of parents with mental illness. But so the support ranges from educational scholarships, out of school tuitions, problem solving at home, and of course free access to medical and psychological and social care support from the Banyan for the parents. But the children, a group of children who've sort of worked, lived their life at the Banyan and grown up at the Banyan, I'm looking at them today, and one of them is today in SRISHTI. 6 years ago, I had sort of spoken to them and interviewed them, or 6 or 8 years ago, and said, what do you want to be? One wanted to be a filmmaker, studying now at SRISHTI. Another child wanted to be, and this is the child of a mother who, is really chronically unwell and ended up over here with chains. Another child two children have joined social work courses, finished their masters. One is working in our Kerala chapter, another is working in our Magupet chapter. Yet another has enrolled for a course in computer science. So they come home and they celebrate our birthdays, we celebrate, so we're like a family. So I don't have children, but these are my children. They give me a lot of support. So I've learned so much from them about resilience, about grit, about empathy. And the good thing that they've done is that they formed a support group amongst themselves to help each other. And soon that group is going to be helping other children with parental mental illness, because the lessons they've learned are invaluable.
Keeping with time, we unfortunately have to ask you the last question for today. And this one is, where do you see Banyan in the next 10 years? If you have an option of changing one thing in the world, what will that be?
I would think the one thing that I would want to change is for Banyan-like organizations not to have to exist. They exist only because the perpetuation of all the problems that we listed through our conversation, right? It doesn't seem to sort of come to an end, a logical conclusion. Whether that is at whether human nature is at the core, whether it's lack of intent, whether it is poor governance, whether it's apathy, one doesn't know what it is. So the one thing that I'd like to change really is for society and state to be more engaged, and for most people in our country really to experience an equitable standard of living, which unfortunately they don't have access to today. Where do I see Banyan 10 years from today? I see it continuing to do what it does with the second line leadership. I'm now only part of the board. We have a second line leadership. So we have new youth leaders who are driving the Banyan in a direction that is absolutely unbelievable with their imagination. So I see this leadership take off. I see them continue to advance the vision, and I see them continue to believe firmly in the vision of the Banyan that justice for all, rights for all, housing for all, and mental health for all is a basic need and a basic right, and not something that should be seen as a dole. So I see us as a passionate, creative organization being led by a passionate, creative team, and continuing to advance our vision over the years.
Dr. Vandana, thank you very, very much. That was a very, very nice conversation that we had, and I certainly enjoyed it. Before we let you go, we have a new addition to the SICCI 360 series. This was started by our co-chair, and we had it going for the last couple of sessions. This is a quick fire round where I will ask you, or I will tell you 5 words, and I would like your response to that. Either it can be a single word, or it can be a phrase, or it can be a sentence. And Professor Murugavel, our co-chair, wanted this added on because he felt that it will add to the liveliness of the program. And we have also encountered it so far. So if I can get your permission and go ahead with it.
Of course.
So the first one is life.
Kindness.
The second one is the Banyan.
My identity.
The third is Miss Vaishnavi.
My soulmate.
The fourth is woman.
Strength.
And the last one is future.
Hopeful.
Very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Vandana. That was a very nice discussion again. Thank you very much. In closing, and as a token of our appreciation, or before that, if I may, as part of the SICCI 360 series, we would like you to autograph your photograph and have today's date affixed on it. We will have this sent to you at the earliest opportunity. If you can kindly autograph it, date it with today's date, and send it to us, we would appreciate it. And as a token of our appreciation, we would like to give you a certificate. I'm sure you've heard of the Kanchi Kamakoti Child's Trust Hospital, which is located in Nungambakam. As part of the SICCI 360 series, we've been donating in the name of our guest to this hospital. This hospital is involved with treating children from underprivileged families and we have donated on your behalf, meaning that the donation that we have done in your name is going to meet the underprivileged child's medical expenses. So this certificate as well, we will have it sent to you. Again, thank you very, very much for participating with us in today's session. And as a chamber, we certainly look forward to being able to assist you in any way that we can as you move forward. I would, in closing, I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the SICCI 360 team for the SICCI 360 series. This team is led by Mrs. Valli Arun, who chairs the SICCI 360 committee. She is president of the Velingro Group and trustee of the Tamil SI Sangam. The co-chair of this committee is Professor T. Murugavel, who is head of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at SVC Chennai. Professor Murugavel is in charge of putting together the discussion points for each one of our sessions. He does the necessary research work on our guest speaker and ensures that he feeds a good set of questions to us so that we can then engage with our guest. Mr. Gokul Santanam, he is Senior Vice President at Emphasis, and he is in charge of the marketing collateral and marketing activities for our SICCI 360 program. Incidentally, Mr. Gokul has also volunteered at the Banyan during his college days, and he certainly is well able to relate to the Banyan as well as what you've spoken today, Dr. Vandana. Mr. Amalan Alavandar is the environment consultant at the Asian Development Bank, and he is in charge of moderating our online chat session and feeding the relevant points to us. Ms. Vilasini M. Arun, a student of clinical psychology, brings the student focus into the SICCI 360 series. And of course, Ms. Bhavani Srinivasan and the rest of the SICCI Secretariat, who's in charge of putting the logistics together for this very effective program that we've been conducting. We've now, as you know, conducted 14 sessions, including today. Our next session is already scheduled, session 15. It's going to be with Dr. Nalli Kupasamy Chetty, chairman of Nalli Silks. This is scheduled for Tuesday, December 14th at 4:30 p.m. Yes, of course, this is going to be held online, but the event itself is going to be at our MAC hall at the chamber, where we are going to have a small audience participating along with us. So if any of you would like to join us on site for this program, please let us know ahead of time so that we can reserve your seats accordingly. We're going to be having only about 50 people on site. So do mark your calendars, and those of you who are not able to join us on site, please join us online, and we'll be glad to have you a part of this program. That brings us to an end of this program. Thank you very much for joining us. We certainly look forward to your ongoing participation with us, and I would like to take this opportunity to wish you all safe times ahead. Thank you very much. Nandri, Vanakkam.